Hey guys, this is Alex, and thank you Rashad for doing the grid component. So I'll be running you through how to build the historical grid component. First of all, let's just have a quick run through of what it is and what it does. So it's a component that lets you to see the state the grid was at each of the specific modified date. As you can see, on the 5th of September, this is what the grid looks like. And we can go to the previous date on the 4th and on the 3rd and so on and so forth. And of course, you can reverse back and see what it looks like on the next date. And you also have the ability to choose which canvas the ID of the canvas. So it gives you a different version of that canvas. And for this canvas with ID 7, as you can see, there's no other modified dates except for the 6th of September because these last date and next date buttons are disabled. And to build this component, we have three things to consider. First is what is the available data that we can get from the backend API. Secondly, what are the states that is required? And thirdly, what sort of data structure or how can we manipulate it such that it satisfies our state requirement? So I'll run you through quickly on the back. So we'll go over to our Swagger UI and have a look at all the data sources that's available to us. So as you can see, for the actions that we performed, we can select the canvas and it returns us the colors of the colors of that specific canvas. Therefore, we will need the get canvas by ID endpoint, and also we are interested in what is the color, what are the colors that it gets updated to when we go to the previous date and the next date. Therefore, we want to get the color data. So this color data helps us to retrieve that data. So I will do a quick run through of. So I'll just demonstrate. Let's say we want to get the color data ID by, I don't know. Hopefully I get it right. 1024, I think. Would there be any? Okay, yep. So there we go. So we can see that the color data ID for this number, so it's a white color for canvas ID 1 at row index of 31 and column index of 31 as well. So these are the three endpoints that we're going to be using. So get color data by ID, get canvas by ID, and also the third endpoint will be get the historical data, of course. So the historical data over here, it tells us, so this is the demo value. It tells us, oops, sorry. So this is historical data is the endpoint that tells us what the old and the new values are. So we'll be leveraging these values to help us update the colors of the grid when we go to the next and the previous date. Okay, so this is the API. These are the things that we need to consider for the API. Secondly, is the state. So what exactly do we need to think about for the state of this particular component? So the major thing to think about is that as you can see here, we have all these dates of this specific canvas with ID 2. So you can imagine it would be we'll be using the canvas ID as the key and the dates. So this is just a mock. It's just an mock object of what we'll be using most probably, and it will have the date. We'll say day 1 and day 2, and so on and so forth. So as you click through this last date, go to the previous date, go back again, and then if you go next date, increment your current index. So basically, you will have this object, and then you will probably have a state that keeps track of which index of this specific array you are in. So this is how we update the date. And also we want to have a state for the canvas ID. So whenever we select a new canvas, it pulls the data, it gets the canvas by this specific ID, which is the endpoint that you can see over here. So that's another state, and we'll have a state for the colors. So we'll be using the grid component, and every time we go to, let's say, the previous date, we run through all the historical data of that date, and we update our color using that. So similarly for when we choose a different canvas, we get the color by the canvas ID, and then we reset the color state. So to reiterate that, what we'll be having is the state that we have is, first of all, you have the index for the date, and the selected canvas ID, and then you will have some sort of data structure that holds all these values that's desirable. So for example, this is a good example of what we want. So we want the canvas ID as the key, and all its a date associated with that canvas. And in this case, we'll have canvas ID 2 and canvas ID 7, and then for canvas ID 7, there's only one date. There's only one date for canvas 7. So this is another object that we want to have. So we'll initialize it to undefined at the start, and then we'll fetch the data and we'll reset that state after the fetch was successful. Okay, so and overall, and then we'll have the colors for the grid. So this would just be a 2D array that holds the data. And finally, we will want to have an object. So this will be this is probably the most complicated object that we'll have, which is we'll use the canvas ID as the key, and we'll have another object which will be the date. We'll use the date as the key, and we'll use all the updated cells as the value. So you'll see multiple of these objects inside this one big dictionary. So to give you a quick example, so for canvas ID 2, so right now we'll have, so it'll be a string, the date will be a string, and so it'll be an array of all the updated cells, so it'll be your old hex and your new hex. So this is basic of your row index and your column index. So this is what will be, or what this, so it will be array of all these objects. And let me change that real quick to the date. Okay, so this is what you will have. And when I go to, oh sorry, this is the canvas ID 7. I want canvas ID 2. So you'll have 5. So as you go to, when you click last date, it would update the color. It will use the old hex of that specific date. So in this case, it's the September the 4th. It will use the old hex of that date. And when I go to next date, it will use the latest version. It will use the latest version of this date. So use the new hex value to update the color of your specific cell. So the last thing that we want to consider is how we can manipulate is the data processing part. How we can manipulate the data such that it satisfies our state requirements. But once you've defined the types, or once you know what kind of objects that your state will be, the manipulation part is usually the easiest. So without further ado, let's try to implement all the fetch methods for our endpoint. So, so we talked about before, we are interested in getting the historical data and the canvas data, and also the color data. So let's have a look at our Swagger UI and what's the endpoint of each of those. So it will be the colors data. Let me collapse this. So it'll be historical data, color data, and canvas with these subpaths. Okay, so for our historical data, this will just be a historical data path. So we'll just define a separate variable called historical data URL. So it'll be, I think we've defined a base URL here already. So we just say API base URL plus the historical data. So we'll copy and paste that and get rid of the API. And we'll define another endpoint. I think for canvas data, you just need to add the canvas to the back of it, which we already have. So that's alright, but we need to do it by the ID. But we just add a parameter into our function. And then we'll add that to the back of our path. And then we want to get the colors data. So that's going to be what is it called? Yeah, it'll just be colors data, and we'll get it by the ID. And then we want to define the types of each of these data data that we can get from these endpoints. So this is get canvas data by ID and also color data by ID. So essentially we'll just append the ID, which is going to be the argument of our functions to the end of this endpoint. We'll add a backslash to it. Okay, so to get the data types, you can infer it from just executing these queries, but I think a better way, or you can just copy and paste from here. I think that's probably a better way to do. Or you can just go to the actual files and then look under the models folder and then you can get the types from there too. So either way is fine. But to save us some time, I have already defined all these types over here now. So we can just copy and paste these over. So as you can see, we've defined a historical data interface, color data interface, and a canvas data interface. So we can define these methods individually. So we want to get the canvas data by ID. Get canvas data by ID, or rather, we get canvas by ID, and it will return a promise of the canvas data, iCanvas data. So this is what it will return. So it's just defining the skeleton code at the moment. And next, we'll define the get color data by ID method. So this is going to be, so this will also take an ID by argument, and this is going to return a promise of the color data. And next up, finally we'll define the get historical data method. And this is going to take no argument, but it will return a promise of just the historical data. It will be, in fact, it will actually be an array historical data. It will be an array of historical data because if you look closely to the Swagger UI, this is what it specifies. So it's an object inside the array. And as you can see in the response object, it's an array containing all these individual historical data items with these specific keys. Okay, so then we will just need to define, then we just use our good old fetch to get the required data. So use the canvas API URL plus our ID, and then we use the argument ID, and then we just return the JSON object of that. So similarly, we can do the same for the get color data by ID and the historical data by ID. And then here we just need to change the URL that we are requesting. And over here we can just change it to historical data API. Yep, so that's good. Then we just need to I need to define that to be, there's a typo over there. And we can just export these three functions, so we can use it. We will use it in another file. So we'll most likely use it in our historical grid component. So we've already got our API methods out of the way. Next, we need to consider exactly the types of the states of our historical grid component is going to be. With that said, we want to first create a historical data component. Historical grid component. So with that, we direct to the components folder. We'll make a folder called historical grid. Oops, sorry, this is a different branch that I'm on. Let me close that first, and I'll create a new terminal, and I'll cd into So this is the project that we will be working on, and we'll create a folder called historical grid, and within that grid we'll make a component called historical grid.txx. And now let's have a look. So we want to do the template code real quick. So I want to say historical grid equals this, and then just export this out. So we want to consider what is the state that it will have. So we mentioned before, it will take in the date index, canvas ID, and then some sort of object that looks like the canvas ID as the key, and you will have an array of dates, and another object which is a 2D array of colors. And we just pass that to our grid component, so we can render that pretty easily. And lastly, we will need some sort of object that, so in fact this canvas ID and as the key and the date as the array actually derives from this object, which is, we'll use the canvas ID as the key, and it will have a object as the value where it will use the date as the key and will take in all the updated cell array. So we can quickly define these type. So we will give them some names. So we'll call this specific type, we'll call it let's call it interface historical data date. So it's going to take in canvas, a map type of canvas ID as the string, and it will take in a array of strings which represents the date. And so this is that out of the way, and we'll also have our let's call this interface transformed historical data. We call it transformed because it derives from the historical data from the endpoint that we will be requesting. So it's gonna look like something which we've already written there. We'll take in the canvas ID as the string, and we'll have an object of the date. We'll have the date as the key, and we'll have all the updated cells. So we have not defined that type just yet, and we'll get into that real quick. So we just give it a placeholder name for updated cell. It'll be an array of that specific object, and over here we just define that type quickly. So this object we are interested in for each specific date. When you go to its previous one or the next one, you are interested in what color it gets updated to when you go to the next one. And when you go to the previous one, you're interested in what color it gets updated to as well. So you want to use the old hex for the previous date and the new hex for the next date. So this particular object will hold old hex key, new hex key, and the row index, which is going to be the number, and the column index is going to be another number. So these are the type that we have. I need to put a D here. So these are all the types that we have for each of our states. So over here we just quickly define we'll quickly define the states that we're going to be using. So first of all, what we'll have is the current date index, and we'll use -1 as the placeholder. And similarly, we'll have the selected canvas ID, and we'll do a set method for that too. Similarly, we'll use a -1 as the placeholder. Then we'll have the colors. So this is going to be an array, and which is going to be a type of, it will be a 2D array of strings, or colors to be more precise. And two more to go. We'll also have the historical data, and this is going to be we'll be using the transformed historical data. It will be initially undefined, and lastly it will be the canvas modified date. Set canvas modified date, and this will take in the type of which we have defined up there. Will take in this specific type. So this is the all the states that we will need for this component, but the implementation we'll just leave it as an abstraction for now, because we know that these are the data that we will need. What we can do then is we need to do some data processing and manipulation to morph the data that we will get from the API into these types that we will want. So for that, we'll create an utils folder, which is short for utilities. We'll go out of our current directory, cd in our source folder. We'll make another folder called utils, and within that folder, we want to create a file called gridhistory.ts. So I'll do a split screen so we can see the types more clearly. In fact, I'll actually just copy and paste these types into grid histories, and then export it out. Export each of them individually out, and I'll let VS Code to resolve all these errors, add all missing imports. And over here, we are actually interested in the data they will get. So we want to, so this historical data date, we can easily get it if we know the canvas ID. It will be a matter of, let's just say we have let's pretend we have historical data here. We just access that using the canvas ID and then we use object.keys of that canvas ID. So this gives us all the modified dates of that specific canvas. So this is this type out of the way. So as long as we have this type, then as long as we have this object, then getting this object is the easy part. And for this updated cell, we need to manipulate our historical data. Okay, so we'll define several helper functions over here. First of all, we want to define get all color data. So this is going to be, I'm going to use promise.all to get an array of all the results of the color data. And secondly, we want to define a function called transform historical data. Historical data. So it will take in a historical data array, and that is going to hold the historical data. So there will be, so this will come from the API when we fetch it. So it will be an array of those data. And let's just try to implement how we want to transform from this array into, let me define that type over here, into this specific type. So we'll initialize our result variable first, which is gonna take in, and we'll say this will have a type of I transformed historical data, and then we just return the result at the end. Then we want to iterate through each of the historical data of that specific array, and then within that we want to, so this is going to be, so as you can see over here, it will actually be all these new values and old values and key values, it will be strings. So we want to pass that string into a JSON object so we can actually easily access the value of each of those. So we don't need to do any heavy lifting string processing to get the value. So to do that, I would like to actually define another helper function called Deserialize historical data. Const Deserialize historical data. And this is gonna take in historical data as the argument, and what it will do is let me first deconstruct this object. So you get the key values, the old values, and the new values from there. In fact, these key values will represent our color data ID. So we will say the color data ID equals to JSON.parse this key values, and then we will use this as the key to access that specific value, and we'll copy and paste this. We'll get, so the O value represents the O hex. So this is the O hex, and this should be the new hex. So use that. So this will be O values, and then hex and dot hex. Similarly, this will be new values and dot hex, and then we just return these as an object. We do O hex, new hex, and also the color data ID. So this is our deserialization function done. So over here we just simply deserialize this historical data, and then we'll deconstruct these values respectively as well. So we'll get the O hex, the new hex, and the color data ID. So the whole point of that is to format it into this structure, which is I update the cell. This is what we want. This is what we want to achieve at the end. So over here, in fact, because we want to do an API call to get the color data by ID, we should probably make this an asynchronous function. So we can use await here. We'll do color data equals await get color data by ID, and then we use this color data as our argument. So import this function. Then actually we can deconstruct this color data. So this color data is gonna have the row index, the column index, which is what we will be interested in. So we want to get the row index and the column index. And then we want to transform. And also, as you can see, we'll have sorry, there's also one more thing. From the historical data, you can actually get the date time as well. So I missed that over here. So you should be able to get the date time as the string, and then you will return that in your deserialize function. You don't need to pass it into a JSON and then process it because there's already a string, so that's fine. The reason why we want to transform the data is because let me show you in the Swagger UI. In the Swagger UI, as you can see here, you will have this. This is a UTC timestamp format, but all we are interested in is the date. So we just want to extract this part out from this datetime value. So we'll use a library called Moment to help us do that transformation. But first we need to first install the library and install the relative types. Okay, so the installation of the Moment library is done. So we can import it over here. Import Moment from Moment. Sweet. So in here we want to transform the UTC value of that date time into our local date value. So we'll say moment dot oh, let me think real quick. It will be moment dot UTC and passing. Oh, we need to get the datetime object from our deserialized historical data. It's going to be datetime. We'll pass in the datetime is the argument, and it will say to local, which I think it's just local, and then you just want to format that into the format that you will want. So in this case, we want it to be year first, and then month, and then day. And we'll extract this to a global variable. So this is we'll call that date format, and then it's gonna go onto the top. So we just call that const date format is going to be equal to this. So we've transformed the data successfully here. Now we just need to do some initializations of our actual array. So we'll say if the result, so because this I transformed historical data will have you take the canvas ID as the alter key, will hold an object as the value, and within the object we have the date. So we need to first check if the canvas ID oh, we need to actually get the, so I actually forgot to get the canvas ID. So the color data, get color data by ID. You can actually get the canvas ID from there. So if the canvas ID is not in this result object, we would like to initialize it to an empty object. And also, if the result canvas ID, if the date value is not initialized, then let me copy and paste this. Then we initialize an empty array. So after these initializations, that you can be sure, you are ensured that you are not manipulating on any undefined values. So over here, you want to format your updated cell. So this is gonna be, this will have a updated cell type. So this is going to be O hex, new hex. We'll take in the row index and also the column index. And finally, we can push in, we can add this into the array. Sweet. So this is our transform historical data done. Now we are also interested in getting this historical data dates data type. So make another function called const historical data date, and this is gonna take in an argument of historical data, and which is going to be the transformed historical data, and this is gonna take output I historical data dates. So this is going to be, as you can see, it will use the canvas ID as the key, and it will take an array of strings. as the value. So just like how we do it in the function that we defined above, we initialize. Oh, let me get the intelligence right. We initialize an empty object, and then we want to iterate through the key of our historical data. Actually, I don't think you would need to use this object keys function. I think you can just do for key of. It's not an array type. Oh yeah, I see. Yeah, that's right. You will want to use this key object or keys function. And then because it's a string, we are interested in, we've defined such that, oh sorry, I think the canvas ID, this should be a number, because this is what we get. This is what we have. I just need to double check. Yeah, it should be a number because this is from our API, we are getting the numbers from the canvas ID and also the color data ID. That's correct. So we actually need to redefine that to a number so that we don't want to process the data multiple times. And then we just transform canvas ID equals transform this key, because it will be a string, into a number. And then what then we can do is we just need to get all the modified dates, canvas modified dates, and this is just going to be a array of strings. So we just access that using the canvas ID that we have above, and then we insert this value, canvas modified dates, into the result. So this result, in fact, why is it an index signature parameter must either be, oh, keep on having typos over here, sorry about that, should be an E over there, number, there we go, yep. And then at the end we just returned our result. So with all these utility functions, we are able to get all these different types that we've defined, which is needed for our state. So the reason why I defined a get all color data function here is because we don't actually want to do this await operation every time inside the loop, because it will be very slow. You can look up promise.or, what it does. So essentially what it does is the promise is trying to get resolved every time you create it. So every time when you await in here, there's extra time taken for that operation. But if you use if you push the promise into an array and then operate it from there, then it's actually the engine is computing all those promises in parallel. So that's why it's faster. So this is gonna take in historical data array and define that type of this, and it will use and this should be return a promise of all the color data, an array of a color data. So what it would do is we'll define, so we just say I will return promise.or, and promise.or expect an array of promises. So what we'll do is we want to use this historical data array. We'll map through it. We'll make this larger. We'll map through it, and then we'll just say use D. We'll use data is the value, and then we'll say get color data by ID. We want to deserialize this historical data, and then we get the color data ID. So this is essentially, in a nutshell, this function, and we need to utilize it over here in our transform historical data. So we'll say all color data equals await get all color data, and expect a data array function. And then over here, instead of iterating through the historical data, we will actually want to access them both in parallel. So I'll comment this out. Actually, I'll just create another for loop over here. So I want to, so the length of the all color data and the historical data is the same, because as you can see here, for each iteration we are making an API call to this get color data by ID. So that's why for the same amount of iteration, you're making the same amount of API calls, API requests for the same amount of iterations. So that's why they have the same. That's why they have the same length. And then over here you can just do you can do object destructuring, and instead of, so you just access the historical data by the index, and similarly you will access the color data by its index as well, and copy and paste that over here, and copy the rest of these over. And right now this will make our code run a bit faster. And then why is it saying this? Oh yeah, I need to add a promise over here, color data ID. Also, we don't actually need this color data ID anymore. And let's just export these functions. And now we've basically finished our utilities functions.